Hi, hello, I'm Sam Harris and I read, review, and discuss fantasy and science fiction video games. So today, I hope that the slightly rejigged intro was fun for you. I am going to be talking about today 13, if I have counted correctly, and remembered that count because I made the notes for this video last week and I finally got around to filming it. This is my 13 of my favourite fantasy and science fiction video games that I am also recommending. So there might be a few video games that I love that I might not explicitly recommend, but I think pretty much all of these are great to play now and widely available. So I've got my list up here, up on the old tablet, and then we're just going to go straight through from the top of the list. And we are starting with one of my favourite games of all time, which is Final Fantasy XII. So Final Fantasy XII is it is a proper fantasy. So a lot of Final Fantasy games kind of are spilling over into sci-fi or into sci-fantasy, which is the kind of thing that you might see from like Star Wars is sci-fantasy, for example, because it has this kind of mystical, unexplained side. Now, Final Fantasy XII is the 12th game in the Final Fantasy series. It's not the 12th game with Final Fantasy in the title, there's probably hundreds, but it's the 12th mainline game. And in Final Fantasy XII, you essentially are playing a street kid called Vaan, who is working with some sky pirates in his ultimate aim to become a full-time sky pirate. There's a big kind of conspiracy going on. There is a really cool world-building thing. There's lots of airships. The world-building thing is like there are these characters called judges who are like ultra powerful, and they have very, very cool armor. And the judges were like I was always interested in Final Fantasy games, and I played most of them over the years after my brother had Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation. So I wasn't able to play. Well, no, I did play his Final Fantasy VII, but I didn't finish it at the time. I ended up finishing it when I moved to university, and my uni flatmate loved Final Fantasy games, and so he basically sat me down and was like, "You need to finish this." And so I did, and then I finished the rest of the games leading up to 12. And 12 was the first one that I had played the day it came out. And this was a game that I absolutely really loved. It had a fantastic setting and world building that I still think about all the time. It had a lot of desert fantasy stuff in it, so one of the reasons why I think I've gravitated towards books like Harbinger of Justice, which had the desert setting. It has airships as well, and I think I've talked about this. I don't know if I've talked about this before or given away any kind of specifics, but actually the setting for my fantasy novel trilogy that I am working on writing is heavily inspired by Final Fantasy XII. So it has airships, and there's lots of the variety of places is quite wide that we go to in the trilogy, but there are desert set sections. There's definitely a character that is inspired by Balthier, who is basically everyone's favourite character from the game. He's the sky pirate captain, and he basically refers to himself as like the leading man, the main character, all throughout the game. And it's funny because he isn't the main character or the lead. He does take the lead in a lot of the story stuff, but yeah. So, I mean, yeah, there's characters inspired by a lot of the characters from Final Fantasy XII inspire a lot of my writing in a way. Like, I've always loved that kind of cocky older male character that Balthier is. I really liked Ash as well. She was one of my favorite characters. She's like a princess, but she doesn't really want to be. Yeah, really, really fantastic game. Absolutely beautiful. Even now, this game came out in like 2007 because it came out not long before the PS3 came out, and that came out in 2007, I think. It was the year I turned 21, which is absolutely Leonardo DiCaprio meme aging. No, it's not Leonardo DiCaprio. Shit, it's Matt Damon. Matt Damon meme. I'm getting very old. But yeah, Final Fantasy 12, I think, has inspired a lot of my like, wow, that's really cool, and I see the elements from that game in other fantasy. They have done a re-release that came out, God, a long time ago now. But the re-release was fully remade with like new graphics and some extras and some cool stuff. It's called the Zodiac Age. Highly recommend playing that one. You don't need to track down the original and find the PS2. Just play the remake. It's on every platform. But I have talked about Final Fantasy 12 for a very long time, so I'm going to go straight into my next pick, which is definitely more of a sci fantasy. And this is the Trails series. So previously, Final Fantasy 12 is a JRPG. I'm a big JRPG fan. They used to be back in the day, back like, you know, before Western games hit consoles and stuff. Western RPGs started to hit consoles more often. Because Western RPGs, things like Planescape Torment and the original Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2 and things like that, they were always really, like, if you wanted a Western game that had a strong story, it was on PC. And I did actually have a gaming PC, but my primary, the gaming method that I liked the most was the PS2, basically. And so I was mostly playing JRPGs because they were the best stories in gaming at the time. And I still love JRPGs to this day. I like the quirks, I like the turn-based battle mechanics, I like the storytelling style. JRPGs almost feel like a more accessible anime storytelling. And that really holds true for my next pick, which is, as I said, the Trails series. So the Trails series is a very, very long series of video games, which I have spent almost a year and a half binging, because each game is like between 30 and 80 hours. Only a couple of them are the short end, are the 30s. They're all, you know, I don't think you could finish any of them in under 30. Like, that's your minimum time. I think the average is probably between 50 and 80, to be honest. So there are 11 now, because the 11th one just came out, which I'm not actually got around to playing it yet. There's 11 games in this series. 3 of them, and it comes in arcs actually as well, so let me explain. So there's 11 games, it comes in arcs. It's a science fantasy JRPG series, and for my money, it is the best long-term storytelling in video games, because, like I was saying, this story is being told across 9 games. It's you start off in the country of Liberl, in a small town with 2 characters, Joshua and Estelle. Estelle is the protagonist, she's the main character. And they are training to become bracers, which are kind of like mercenaries, but they don't do like shady stuff. They mostly do like things that the cops won't touch, or like aren't interested in, or they work in places where there are no police. The army has a very light presence, for example, maybe. And they get involved in like big conspiracies, and you know, the world goes to the brink of war, and there's a secret organization called Ouroboros that is doing some wild stuff behind the scenes. Essentially, the first Sky trilogy is a really interesting start to this series, and there's some great characterization for Estelle and Joshua. And then we shift over from the Sky trilogy into the Crossbell duology, which is where this is set in a part of the world that is, I would say, reminiscent of Hong Kong almost. So it's a city-state, It is caught between two major world powers, in fact, multiple major world powers, and has right on its border the big evil empire, which have been the Erebonian Empire, which have been the villains of the first 3 games and continue to be the villains of the Crossbell duology. In this game, you don't play as bracers, you actually play as cops, but you play as a special new division of the Crossbell Police called the Special Support Section, and they have basically been spun up to act as bracers do, but with police oversight, essentially. This is many people's favourite part of the series. The smaller focus on the city-state was really interesting. This is where the games get really political. They do stay political, but this is like the very first time that you get into that political storytelling. And then after this, the next arc is 4 games long and actually sees you in the Erebonian Empire. So the evil militaristic empire that has been the antagonist for the first 5 games, or if not the antagonist, definitely an antagonizing force, they become the protagonists. And this is a really interesting swerve, and I really liked it. And the characters that you play in the Erebonian arc, the Cold Steel arc, are teenagers at a military academy. They do eventually, graduate and join the actual military, and there is a massive war. There's a fantastic Civil War section, which I really loved. And these games really do follow on one to the next. So each arc, the games almost feel like books in a fantasy series. So if you love long-running fantasy series with incredible world building, the Trails series is absolutely the best comparison in video game. There's nothing even close in video games that, apart from the Trails series. You get things that come up in, the first ever video game that are paid off in the 9th, for example. There's mysteries and big reveals all the way along. There is a fantastic kind of theme or subplot where the world is kind of starting to get technology. So as the games go on, you start to see things like cars become more common instead of horses. You start to see internet and mobile communication technology, and the speed that their technology comes on, because it's kind of science but also merged with this fantasy element, it's actually their civilization is moving on very, very quickly. And there's some really interesting stuff where you kind of get that the civilization, the society in the world of Trails is not ready for the level of technological advancement that it's received. And that's just, that's one of the subplots. There are a lot of character relationship subplots. There are some really interesting political subplots and, in fact, political main plots. I could literally talk about this game for hours. This series of games for hours. I think that they're genuinely some of the best storytelling, especially in JRPGs, and absolutely the best long-form story in video games, and I will stand up forever and keep saying that. Mostly because I think it's the longest, probably continuous game story in video games in terms of our count. Maybe something like World of Warcraft or whatever could rival it, but I genuinely don't think so. Next up, we have a perennial favourite of the fantasy world, which is Baldur's Gate 3. So this came out, I want to say last year? Let's just say last year, whether it did or did not. And I actually only played Act 1 of Baldur's Gate 3. This is Act 1 of 3, so there's 3 acts in this game, and I played the first one, and I didn't even finish it, and I put 30 hours in. That tells you how much game there is, how much world there is to explore. Larian Studios, the people who made Baldur's Gate 3, have done something genuinely you might have thought of as impossible in previous video games, which they have made an almost one-to-one translation of playing D&D with a group of friends. But they've also done the thing that you get in D&D, which is they thought of thousands of outcomes and how each of these outcomes interact with each other. And there's so much story that you might never see because you don't recruit one of the party members in the beginning, for example. Like, I didn't recruit a party member called Gale, and everyone makes memes about him online, and I was like, no idea who this man is. I don't think it needs to go into too much detail on Baldur's Gate 3 because it, won Game of the Year from multiple publications last year. It was incredibly popular, and if you've got a PC, even a PC that is actually quite old and rubbish, like I've been able to play it on my old rubbish laptop. If you have a PC, then that's probably the way to play it. If you don't, the console editions, I'm reliably informed, are very, very good. They just aren't as good as the PC one. Next up, we have what I would say I don't think this is controversial to say, I think this is probably the best fantasy game ever made, which is The Witcher 3. So, The Witcher 3 is an incredible achievement by developers CD Projekt Red. They have this fantastic, massive, cohesive world inspired by the books of Andrzej Sapkowski, where we really get to see not just this big, epic story, but we also get to see the minutiae and the daily life and what it's like to be a Witcher, what it's like to roll up into a new town or village, be told that they've got a monster that's eating their sheep, and then you have to go out and kill that monster. And it turns out that the monster's eating the sheep is the town mayor's daughter. And then you have to cure her of her monster curse, or maybe you kill her and you don't tell anyone, or you kill her and you tell everyone that it was her. Every quest has tons of different options. There's so much emotion in some of the storylines. It's just a fantastic, genuinely fantastic game. And it's one of those games where if you haven't played it, it does have a little bit more of a learning curve than so like, for example, the JRPGs or the Baldur's Gate, which is you can pause the action at any time. So all of those are not real time. You can pause the action at any time. You can sit and think and be tactical. But with The Witcher, it is an action game, so there is that slight lower accessibility factor there. So if you're not someone who plays action video games, you might struggle with it. However, I do think it's worth it for the story, which I think most people say they think is the best interpretation of the Witcher story. So better than the books, better than the show. And it's the video games that got Henry Cavill into the books, which got him to pursue an adaptation with Netflix. So if you want to follow in Henry's footsteps, then the first step is to get really jacked and play The Witcher 3. Next up, we have a mythology-led fantasy, I guess, which is God of War. And this is the 2018 game that came out on the PS4. And that year, multiple games came out in favourite of all-time franchises for me. And I've never liked the God of War games. I always thought they were fine, but nothing to write home about. And then God of War 2018 was my favourite game of that year. And I think probably my favourite game on PS4. God of War 2018 is just this incredible story about fatherhood, about building a relationship with your son. And as I was playing God of War 2018 was also when my wife and I first started talking about wanting to have children, and not just it being like an abstract, like, oh yeah, one day I'd like to have kids, but it became a reality of, I want to have kids someday soon. And then, we had Peter 1 year later. So 2019, my son was born. So you can really see how close together me playing this game that is all about fatherhood and is all about building a relationship with your son and how close that was to me actually playing, me being a father. And now I have 2 kids, which is mad. God of War 2018 is the story of Kratos, who was a Spartan in ancient Greece. His family was killed by Ares, the god of war. Is it Ares in? We'll just say it's Ares, right? It's Ares in Greek mythology. Is Mars in Roman mythology, isn't it? I think. Anyway, so he was killed by Ares. Kratos gets very angry about this, and then basically goes all the way through every god on the way to killing Hades, and then eventually he actually goes to Mount Olympus and kills Zeus and all of the gods. So he kills all of the Greek gods. Then sometime between then and the 2018 game, Kratos escapes Greek mythology for Norse mythology. So if you like, Odin and Thor and Balder and Freya, these characters are all major characters in God of War 2018. His son is Atreus, who's named after one of his best friends back in Sparta. And Kratos and Atreus basically are kind of thrust together after the death of his wife, who seems to have been the primary caregiver for Atreus. And they are kind of forced together without the buffer of the wife and mother. And the storyline is just fantastic. The cast is incredible. Everything is motion captured, so the emotion is right there on the digital faces. It's just a perfect video game. There's very, very few games that I would say, you know what, this is a 10 out of 10. And God of War 2018 absolutely is a 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10 video game. I don't think... I have played games that I have fallen in love with and played forever, like over and over and over for hundreds of hours, but there's nothing like 2018. So next up is one of the last fantasy games, like straight up fantasy games on the list, which is going to be a controversial one. I'm going to tell you now, because this is the least favourite game in this series for many, which is Dragon Age 2. So Dragon Age was made by BioWare. The Dragon Age series was made by BioWare, which is a Canadian company founded by 2 doctors who make medical software, but they love video games. And so eventually they started building video games with the money they made from this medical software stuff, and they made a load of really classic RPGs, and one that we'll talk about in a little while. But one of the ones that really hit for me was the Dragon Age series. So I loved Dragon Age Origins. I loved it so much I actually have a tie-in novel that I bought and read, and I thought the tie-in novel was so good. It's still on my shelf now, over like 15 years later. But Dragon Age 2 was a really interesting prospect. So in Dragon Age 1 you created your own character, and they were kind of this blank slate, and then you kind of experienced the world through this blank slate silent protagonist. Dragon Age 2, your character got a name. You became Hawke. You you had a backstory, you had a history, and I loved that about Dragon Age 2. It also took into account even the story decisions that you made in Dragon Age 1, which was very cool. The whole of Dragon Age 2 is set in a city, and you go on forays out of the city to do, missions and quests and stuff like that. But, you live in the city, all the other characters live in the city, you get to spend time and, build these relationships. And Dragon Age 2 reminds me a lot of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, where they obviously have this static city, where the city in space as the space station, where in a lot of fantasy games it's all about the quest. But the thing I really liked about Dragon Age 2 is it was all about the place. It was all about the people that lived in that city. And it was really maligned at the time for it not being about quests, for it being, you know, you're in this city and this is where all the stories are happening. And was that cheaper to make? Probably. Were a lot of the missions on very, very similar areas of the world? Yes. But I would say that for me and my money, this is the best Dragon Age game and one of the best fantasy RPGs, Western fantasy RPGs, for my money. Science fiction games. So most of those games were fantasy or science fantasy, but I have a few games that are much more pure sci-fi. So I'm going to start with a game that is not for everyone, but it's one that I do highly recommend. And if you're the kind of person who likes to be challenged with your stories, if you're the kind of person who really enjoys interesting story structure, then I'm going to recommend Nier Automata. So this is an action RPG from Square Enix. These are the people that published the Final Fantasy games. This was the vision of a man called Yoko Taro. This is another Japanese game. You play as 2B, who is an android who lives on the moon, who comes down to Earth to basically do missions for a nebulous group of humans who are hoping to return to the Earth once it's been cleared of, you know, monsters, evil robots, etc. And Nier Automata is a fun action game, but it's also got some incredible music. The soundtrack is sung in many cases in a way that is very uncommon in video games. Songs with lyrics are not popular in video games, especially not for like action sequences. You might have a song with a lyric for like, oh, these characters are sitting down and they're listening to a song and talking or whatever, but like actual action sequences with singing, and the soundtrack is genuinely incredible. I don't want to play any of the soundtrack in this video because I don't want to get, you know, dinged for it if in future I'm able to monetize the video, but it is definitely something that you should track down and listen to if you can. There's so much good stuff in Nier Automata. I'm going to try, I just had a thought that I could try and put clips on the side of the screen here, like a few bits and bobs of clips if I can. I'm going to try and put a clip up, definitely, of Nier Automata, because I want you guys to see how cool it looks. But it's a really interesting game because the story structure and the way they tell the story is incredibly interesting. So when you beat the game, when you see credits for the first time, you are then able to load that save again, and you are playing as a completely different character, and the story starts to very slightly diverge, and you're able to do this again and again, and every time the story diverges you see more of this kind of final true shape of what the story really is. And I honestly couldn't recommend it more. It's such a fantastic game. This is probably one of the first games I thought of that made me think about writing this list, and because it isn't as popular as some of the others, so this is probably the one you're least likely to have played, but it also did get, you know, lots of Game of the Year awards. It's incredibly well liked. So yeah, hunt it down and give it a play. It's available on PC, and I'm pretty certain they re-released it on modern consoles as well. If not, it's backwards compatible. It's playable on PS4 and Xbox One. It's not an old game at all. Next up, we have, also by BioWare, makers of Dragon Age, the Mass Effect trilogy. So this was actually very recently re-released as like a full trilogy game. Mass Effect 2 is the most beloved one. Mass Effect 3 is maybe my favourite. So the Mass Effect is basically the people who made BioWare they made some Star Wars games before they made anything else. They made the Knights of the Old Republic games, which are very good. But they went from making these Star Wars games and going like, well, we kind of want to make something that's Star Trek-y, but isn't a Star Trek game. And that's where they came to Mass Effect. So it's a much more kind of hard sci-fi universe. So it is much closer to Star Trek than Star Wars. You have an incredible set of alien characters. You have a really fun world that's been really well thought out and really well built. And the three games all play into each other. So the story that starts in Mass Effect 1, you carry through all the way to the third game. And well, they're not as long as the Trails games at all. You know, I think you could beat all of those games in 15 to 20 hours at most. I think it's one of the best long form stories in games. It's not as, again, I do think that the Trails story is better, but I've got a lot of time for Mass Effect, and I would really, really rate it. If you haven't played this game, then I'd be surprised because it was incredibly popular. But if you're just getting into games after a long break, then this is definitely something to search out. And if you have something like Xbox Game Pass, then the Mass Effect trilogy is free as part of EA Play. So definitely give that a shot. It's so much game, and all of the games are good. Next up, we have a game that you could play forever, which is No Man's Sky by Hello Games. So I think this is this maybe the best sandbox game I've ever played? I think so. So when I say a sandbox game, this game is less about the story. There are actually some really interesting stories to be told in No Man's Sky. However, this is less about the story and more about being in that sci-fi world. So I've actually played this game for quite a lot. I've even played it in VR, and the feeling of actually being in No Man's Sky with a VR headset, it was absolutely mad. Like being able to like push the canopy up on your spaceship and climb out and stuff, it was wild. But that's a bit of a tangent. If you've got a VR headset, definitely pick this one up. If you don't have a VR headset, it's still a fantastic game. This is a first-person game. You play as a unnamed astronaut who crash lands on a planet, and you crash land or wake up, I would say actually, more than crash land. You wake up next to a crashed shuttle, and you then have to gather the resources and the equipment to fix that shuttle and take off and leave the planet. But when you leave the planet, you go into a procedurally generated infinite universe. There are millions upon millions of planets, and you might, travel for 10 hours without ever even touching another planet that another human being has visited. And this is a game that's been running for 8 years and has been incredibly popular. So if you can play for like days and days without touching a planet that another person has seen, that shows you how massive this universe is. I believe it is essentially infinite. So yeah, if you're looking for one of those games, and this is a fantastic one to play audiobooks with. So I have sometimes listened to sci-fi audiobooks when they were a little simpler stories. So like the Red Rising trilogy, for example, I have sat down and listened to a couple of hours while playing No Man's Sky, and I think that's a really, honestly, quite a good way of playing these more simpler novels, ones that aren't like, I wouldn't do it with like a Sun Eater, for example, but I would happily do it with Red Rising. So yeah, No Man's Sky, absolutely, massively recommend. One of the best science fiction games of all time. One of the best sandbox games of all time, maybe the best, I think. And it's a game that, like I said, if you want to play something like this, it is literally infinite. You can play it forever. And there's more to discover, there's more to do. You can build bases now, you can have capital ships, you can have freighters, you can have pets, you can have ground vehicles, you can have mechs, and they're just adding more and more and more. And they've even added recently multi-biome planets, which is cool as hell. And I say next year, at some point, they're actually making a fantasy version of this called Light No Fire, which I think, unfortunately, is going to completely take over my life. Next up on the sci-fi, we have one of the wildest sci-fi stories in video games, which is Destiny 2. So, Destiny 2 is, I would say, one of the best playing games, like the best feeling, the best controlling, the best playing game ever made. Like, if you said, tell me the best games ever made in terms of how they feel to play, it would be very, very close to the number one spot. Everything about the game is engineered to make it feel incredible. Like, from when you shoot an enemy and their head explodes into like a vapor, which happens with certain enemies. Destiny 2 is an online live service game, and one of the biggest problems with this is that I can't recommend you play Destiny 2 for, I would say, its second most exciting aspect. So the number one being how good the gameplay is. And the number two aspect, honestly, is how good the story is. So the story is absolutely wild. It's very science fantasy. It's got, worm gods. It's got ancient aliens. It's got hive species. It's got like ghosts that possess dead enemies and things like. It's just super cool. And it's got a robot race called the Vex that are powered by a liquid called Vex milk. It's just so cool. Everything about Destiny's story and world building is awesome, and I love it. And it's just very unfortunate that because it's a live game, you now cannot experience the story the way that I did. And even now, I dropped off of the game because there was like a new kind of big drop of campaign missions every year that you would pay money for. When we had the kids, I just didn't have the time for it, and now I'm so far out that actually I wasn't able to finish the story that I started because the story missions that I needed to play from where I stopped playing had been removed from the game, because that's kind of the nature of the live service, which is unfortunate. I was really hoping that they would make a Destiny 3 so that I could get in again from the start, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. Still, it's worth experiencing the world of Destiny 3 and the elements of the story that you can experience now. It's also free to play. You can play this game completely for free. And finally, the gameplay is just so good. You can't go wrong. You've got to play it. Next up, we have one of my favorite games in years. This game actually came out the year that my son was born, 2019. Oh no, was it 2020? I can't remember when this came out. This game is called Control. It's made by Remedy, who are one of the best game developers currently making games. In Control, you play as a character called Jessie, and she is looking for her brother. And she thinks that she has like a lead on him in a building in New York called run by a government agency. And this government agency is called the Federal Bureau of Control. And the second she walks in, everything is kind of wrong. There's no one really around. There's just a creepy janitor. And the further she goes in, the more things seem to have gone wrong, and the less it seems like there is a way out. The building is called the Oldest House. It reconfigures and moves and is alive in a way that almost kind of like the Hogwarts castle was, where like the stairs would move and stuff and the paintings would move. But this is more like an X-Files-y interpretation of that. So you've got like weird items and objects that cause effects in the world. You've got a gun of mysterious origin that she just kind of gets She is given a fairly high-ranking job at the FBC fairly early on in the game, and then it's up to her to kind of discover what went wrong in the FBC, who's behind it, what's happened to her brother, what's happened to the other characters. There's some fantastic video scenes that are shot for the game, so like proper video rather than like actual real characters on screen. It's just a fantastic game. I've got so much time for it. They made an Ultimate Edition, which is available on basically everything, and that's the one that you should play because it's got all the DLC in it. One day I will go back and finish all of that. I did buy Alan Wake 2, which is the kind of sort of sequel to this game for my Xbox. But now we have the second baby, I tend to spend my free time, if I'm going to play video games, I'll play it on a handheld or something, so I won't actually don't really get to touch my Xbox much anymore. Finally, we come down to the final two games, and the first one is Titanfall 2. This is a first-person shooter by the guys who invented Call of Duty. You play as a soldier, and you've got as a partner a giant mech. And the mech and you kind of, like, say you have this partnership, and you're able to you have these big first-person shooter levels with tight corridors, really interesting shooting, great mechanics, and some really fun traversal stuff. And then you'll be led into like an open area to have a mech on mech battle, and the mechs like fire down from the sky. It's just very cool, and there's some incredibly cool environments to fight through. So there's one where you are going through a giant 3D printer that prints towns. There's one mission which has time portals in, so you might accidentally fall through a portal and go back to the inciting incident that you were investigating as part of the mission. The story is mad good. It's genuinely fantastic. The relationship you have with the mech is wild. I never would have expected it at all. It's not just a piece of machinery. It is much closer to a friend in the game, and there are some really emotional moments. There's some really emotional moments that I think will really hit you hard if you play it again now. And this is another one that is free with EA on Xbox Game Pass, and I believe you can just pay for the EA subscription outright on PlayStation and PC and stuff, so you can just play it there. Finally, maybe my most controversial recommendation, which is a game called Starfield. So this came out last year from people who made Skyrim and Fallout. This is a company called Bethesda, and they made this game called Starfield, which was basically in a space version of their standard open world Elder Scrolls and Fallout games. So it doesn't have as much in the way of the exploration that you get in those games, but I've really found that I liked the world building a lot. It probably helped that I did the best storyline in the game, which is the working for the military in that game, as the first story that I played through, and that really made me fall in love with the game, and it also gave me a load of really cool bonuses, and I think that genuinely that is the best storyline in the game, and it's not even close. But the world building is fantastic there. I really enjoyed the snippets of characters that you meet. It's not the best game, I will say that now. This is a proper 7 out of 10. And there's the thing that I often see in the video game world, which is where a game can be flawed but interesting and still make me want to pump 100 odd hours into it. And Starfield is absolutely that game. So I loved playing Starfield. I played over 100 hours easily, and I will definitely be going back for the Shattered Space expansion when it releases this year. If you're looking for a space version of Skyrim, so a game that you can spend hundreds and hundreds of hours doing stuff in. There's a lot of stuff that I didn't finish, so I did all the main authored story content, but there were hundreds of other missions and dynamically generated activities. There was base building, there was relationship building, there was starship building. Everything you kind of want is all in this game. Maybe it's not executed in the best way, but it's definitely one that I'd recommend. So yeah, those are a list of 13 of my favourite science fiction and fantasy games, and science fantasy, I guess, as well. You've probably seen that the majority of the games have a very strong story focus. There's only a few that are more gameplay and mechanics focused, and that kind of is one of the reasons why I think I lent into really enjoying reading, and that was the first thing that got me into reading was the science fiction and fantasy worlds that I love. I say first thing that got me into reading. The first thing that got me back into reading was the science fiction and fantasy worlds that I loved, and then it kind of shows, like I'm so into reading now. Reading is my number one hobby. I play video games a couple of nights a week maybe, but whereas before it used to be literally like that would be all I would do with my spare time, play video games. And now I spend that time reading, which I have found the main benefit is that the stories are obviously much better in books than they are in pretty much any medium, because of the time you have and the way you can tell those stories and the imagination of the reader. And the big thing also is just getting away from screens. I'm not one of those people who is worried about the amount of time I spend looking at screens, but I would like to look at physical books, ideally when possible. So I'll pick up my copy of Crown of Swords here, or I might look at the Kindle, which is technically a screen, but it's not backlit in the same way that this very bright tablet next to me or the phone I'm recording on are. So yeah, that's been the main benefit for me, I think, is just less time looking at screens. And when you look at a screen literally all day long for work and sit at a desk looking at a screen, do you want to do that with your evening free time when I want to play Baldur's Gate, for example? That was one of the reasons I don't think I ever finished that game, was just because I didn't want to sit at my work desk and look at my work monitor just using a different computer plugged into it, But anyway, that's a long-winded roundabout way of saying that I love video games and I love books. I may spend more of my time reading books at the moment, but my love for video games is going to be here with me forever. It's something that I also really enjoy doing with friends, which is you can't really do with books. Let me know what your favourite video games are, fantasy and science fiction specifically. I don't mind if you want to go outside that realm, but I think fantasy and sci-fi is kind of what the channel's about. This is one of the longest videos that I've made in forever, and it's one of the longest videos that is just me. So I would appreciate a like, a share, a subscribe, and drop those comments down below, as I said, to let me know what you're playing and what your favourite games are. And I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I did enjoy doing the research and recording it with you guys. Well, not with you, for you. Hope you have a nice day, and I will speak to you tomorrow.